Hey everyone, I apologize that I can't be with you today for this lecture, but we will review everything we talked about. We're going to review again when we see each other again. So this week, we're going to talk about the subject of learning. Over the years, you have learned all kinds of facts, actions, relational concepts, and theories. At some point early on, you even learned how to walk and talk. Later, you learned that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Hopefully, you've learned that. Years later from that, you learned how to solve maybe for X. You've also learned how to say thank you and please when somebody opens the door for you or when you would like a glass of water. Maybe the best way to get from what you want from your parents. You've learned that. You've also, kind of learned what voice not to use with your parents. Don't give them attitude. You've also learned that there are certain things to fear and certain things or people you enjoy being around. You've learned a whole lot already in your life. But have you ever asked this question? How did I learn these things? In this chapter, we're going to distinguish between 3 different ways in which we learn. Classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and what is called cognitive social learning. So let's get started with classical conditioning today. First of all, we need to identify what is learning. Learning is, quite simply, defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that occurs as a result of experience. I have to tell you, I'm kind of proud of this definition because it's just so pretty and compact. But what we're going to do with it is actually tear this definition apart into 4 factors that form the definition of learning. Okay, you ready? The first is learning is inferred from a change in behavior or performance. In other words, you have to have, if you were doing something one way, there's going to be a change in the way you do it. So once you learn 2 plus 2 equals 4, you will never go back from that. Because number 2, learning also results in an inferred change in memory. You can't forget that 2 plus 2 equals 4 if you truly learned it. Learning can also be a result of experience, and learning is relatively permanent. This means that behavior changes that are temporary or due to things like drugs, alcohol, etc. are not learned. So if you say, hey, look what I can do when you are under the influence, that is not something you learned. It is something that your lower inhibitions may have allowed you to do, but you didn't necessarily learn how to do it. So let's begin with classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is learning to make an involuntary or reflex response to a stimulus other than the original natural stimulus that normally produces the reflex. And I know this sounds like just a lot of, like a different language a little bit, but we're going to go through and, again, break this all apart and take it piece by piece so you can understand it. So let's start with who came up with classical conditioning. Well, there was this Russian physiologist by the name of Yvan Pavlov. You may have heard of him because, honestly, his research was pretty famous. He was able to explain classical conditioning through his research. So let's talk about what he did. What Pavlov did was he took a dog and he gave him food. That sounds pretty simple. He noticed when the dog was presented with food, the dog produced saliva. Salivation was actually a reflex. He didn't have to train the dog to salivate when food was presented. It just happened. We all have different reflexes. So when something blows into your eyes, for example, your reflex is to blink or maybe you tear up. Something like a ball gets thrown at you kind of towards your face, you instinctively flinch. Flinching is a reflex. So Pavlov labeled this reflex as an unconditioned response, and whatever produced the reflex was an unconditioned stimulus. So in Pavlov's experiment, the food was the unconditioned stimulus, and the salivation would have been the unconditioned response. Here's a picture of the apparatus that Pavlov built for his research. The dog had a tube surgically implanted into the dog's cheek that would collect the dog's saliva for measuring. Because remember, in science, we want to be able to have measurable variables. So this was how Pavlov could measure the dog's response to the stimulus. The next part of Pavlov's experiment involved a stimulus that was called a neutral stimulus. It was a bell or a tone, and he rang a bell which really should not have produced any response from the dog. But here's where the classical conditioning part comes into play. When Pavlov would ring the bell, he would very quickly present the dog with food while the bell was ringing. Doing this again and again was called pairing, and trained the dog that when the bell rang, food was also going to come and therefore produce salivation. The bell went from being a neutral stimulus to becoming what he called a conditioned stimulus. Pavlov stopped presenting the food, and the bell would still elicit salivation. This is now called the conditioned response. Now, I know I've thrown out a whole lot of terms while telling about Pavlov's experiment, so we're going to give you the actual definitions. By the way, you will need to have a really good grasp on these concepts for your homework this week. I'm going to run through these, so please feel free to pause and write your notes at each slide, but let's get going here. Okay, the first term, unconditioned stimulus, is a natural occurring stimulus that leads to an involuntary reflex or response. So, a bright light shines into your eyes, your pupils naturally contract. You have food presented, you salivate. Like I said, if something comes at your face, you flinch. Okay, so that is an unconditioned stimulus. Anything that produces the reflex. Your unconditioned response is an involuntary reflex response to a natural occurring or unconditioned stimulus. So examples, that car pulls out in front of you. That's going to be the unconditioned stimulus because you thought you were in danger. Your heart rate increases. That's your unconditioned response. You go jogging. You sweat. That is a reflex. Your body does that to cool itself down. You feel sick, you may vomit. Or if you have something, if you have the unconditioned stimulus might be like food poisoning or something like that. Your response to food poisoning would be vomiting or nausea. Something gets in your eye would be the stimulus. Your response would be you get tears. Salivating, blinking, all of these are reflexes that are unconditioned. We did not have to train you. The conditioned stimulus. Let's see. The conditioned stimulus, it takes what we call the neutral stimulus, which is something that has nothing to do with any reflex, and it becomes able to produce a learned reflex response by being paired with the original unconditioned stimulus. So in the case of Pavlov, it was the bell or the tone. We can do this with a light. We can do this with an odor. We're going to give you a lot of examples for this today, and so just keep that in mind. Then your conditioned response is the learned reflex response to a previously neutral but now conditioned stimulus. So the conditioned response again with Pavlov's dogs were when they got food and the bell should not have gotten any response, but because he paired the two, now he could just ring the bell and it would produce salivation. So one thing just to keep in mind, the unconditioned response will always be the same as the conditioned response. So, following are a number of examples. You need to understand how the CR, CS, UCR, and UCS interact, but of course you do not have to write down every example. So back to food being presented is our unconditioned stimulus. The dog salivating is our unconditioned response. If you have a dog, you know that it kind of knows the signs of when you're going to feed it. So maybe it's you getting its bowl or you walking over to the area that the food is kept. The dog will start salivating. Even though you walking should not produce salivation, it's not a reflex, but it has been paired. How about the flu bug? The flu bug is your unconditioned stimulus. Vomiting is the unconditioned response. When we pair that with your favorite restaurant or food that you ate last night before you got sick, now every time, because that originally was a neutral stimulus, it though has become the conditioned stimulus, because now every time you eat that food, it reminds you of that time you got sick, and it either makes you nauseous or you vomit, and that is now the conditioned response. How about sadness over a breakup? You're sad over a breakup, and so you cry. Your sadness is the unconditioned stimulus. Your crying would be the unconditioned response. But you know what? There was a song you guys listened to all the time, and it was your song. It became the conditioned stimulus because that song meant so much in the relationship. So now every time you hear it, you cry. And it is now, the song is the conditioned stimulus, the crying is now the conditioned response. And lastly, as an example, you have no food or low blood sugar. You have hunger pains. These are your unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. Remember, unconditioned means not trained. You know what? You seem, though, to get hungry every day around the same time, like at 11:30 or noon. And so now you actually may not have hunger, but when you look at the clock at 12, you go, I think I'm feeling hungry. That clock, it now becomes your conditioned stimulus, and your conditioned response is hunger pains. Okay, we're not done yet, so go on to the next slideshow, and we're going to follow up with how our emotions can be classically conditioned. We'll see you soon.